Hi everyone, and welcome to this video where we look at a member of my classic computer collection. And today's video, like many of the ones I've done recently, is a high definition remake, and it's of a nostalgic favourite of mine. It is the very first machine I ever owned. It's the Dick-Smith System 80. So let's check it out. The Dick-Smith System 80 was designed and manufactured by a small Hong Kong electronics gadget company called EACA. In the late 1970s, this company specialised in video Pong-type games and similar gadgetry. In 1979, seeing the potential in microcomputers and perhaps being influenced by the Taiwanese Apple II clones that were starting to appear, EACA designed a model with a high degree of compatibility to Radio Shack's TRS-80 Model 1, which had been launched a couple of years previously. The Model 1 had done well and now had a large software base, especially for the 16 kilobyte model. The EACA machine was introduced to this part of the world by Dick Smith of Dick Smith Electronics. Dick Smith, now an Australian icon, had started out as an electronic repairman but had an aptitude for business and promotion. By 1980, he owned a string of electronic stores in some of the Australian cities. At that time, he also had a relationship with EACA, sourcing some of their gadgets for his retail chain. He was already selling a computer through his stores, the Exidy Sorcerer, but he saw what EACA had come up with and seized the opportunity to sell this machine with the Dick Smith brand on it. Being TRS-80 Model 1 compatible, there was a ready-made CF software, so it had to be a winner, especially if it was less expensive than the Model 1 and had more features. Deals were done, and in late 1980, the Dick Smith System 80 was unleashed on an unsuspecting public. Here we see Dick Smith with his System 80 from one of his early advertisements. The picture is as much a testament to the fashions of the time as the computer, but you have to admit, the machine looks smart. Dick Smith opened his first store in New Zealand in 1981, and this ad proudly announces that the computer of the decade is now available in this country. This was the year I bought mine, but from a third-party reseller, as there was no Dick Smith store in my hometown. It cost about 2/3 of the TRS-80 Model 1. Still, that meant forking out over 1,200 New Zealand dollars, which was about 650 US. That was about 8% of my net annual salary, for something I didn't really know what I'd do with. But to own and to be able to program your own computer without punch cards, well, that was something that was really cool. Here's another advertisement showing some of the things you could get for the System 80. I always enjoyed these Dick Smith ads. Even for the times, they dripped with cheese and hyperbole, but in a somewhat self-mocking way, which made people smile and warm to Dick Smith as an amusing Aussie character. Here's one more ad to look at. I wanted to show you this ad because the equipment that Dick Smith has there at the top is what I eventually ended up with. A Dick Smith System 80, a screen from Dick Smith, exactly as shown there, and one of these large dot matrix printers. It was a C-Ito printer. It was huge, it was noisy, and it used to shake the desk when it was printing something. I've still got the box that it came in, and here it is. It's a little battered after 33 years of transport and storage, wedged in between two styrofoam pads. When I first got it, it was also wrapped in plastic. So that's how I originally saw it when I opened the box. So here is the System 80 out of the box. You can see it takes up quite a bit of desk real estate, but I find it an attractive looking system with its cream case, its white keys, black trim, and a few grey buttons. There's a certain aesthetic to it. It's got a built-in tape recorder. This was one of the selling points over the TRS-80 Model 1. The data recorder was built in rather than being a separate unit. Now you'll notice there's a level meter and a volume control up the top there. The very first models of the System 80 were without these items, and this caused a few problems. Many tapes were of varying quality and also had programs recorded at different volume levels. The System 80 needs a particular volume range to load programs successfully, And if the tape was a little too quiet or a little too loud, there was nothing you could do about it. Tape simply failed to load. So the meter and volume control gave a visual representation of the recorded volume, and you could adjust it for optimum playback. That switch you can see up there is one I added. The System 80 has a second cassette port out the back, and this allows you to switch input and output from the internal cassette recorder to an external one. Those grey keys, F1 controls the cassette motor, and the other key page lets you toggle between a right and left virtual screen if you have 32-column mode enabled. And I'll come back to that when I show you the back. Keyboard's a standard QWERTY keyboard, similar to the TRS-80 Model 1, except there are no arrow keys labelled. Actually, they are there in this model. They are just labelled backspace, tab, escape and control. However, the first System 80 models were missing that tab or right arrow key and the clear key. And this was quite bad news for System 80 gamers, as most Model 1 software used both of those keys. But that deficiency was soon rectified, as this later model demonstrates. There you can see the Dick Smith System 80 logo there on the faceplate, proudly proclaiming this is a third generation computer. The side view shows a sloping wood veneer, influenced by the sold computer, I'm sure, and not too different from the Exidy Sorcerer or the Ohio Scientific Challenger series. Here we go around the back, and you can see there we have a power supply unit. This is quite self-contained and can be removed reasonably easily. Next is a socket for the second tape recorder. This is something you could only get in the TRS-80 Model 1 if it had an expansion unit. Now next to that there's a socket for a monochrome composite monitor. Next to that there's a small switch that I've added, and this allows sound from the TRS-80 games to be ported out the cassette out lead connected to the external tape recorder DIN plug. Plug an amplifier into this and you have sound, as you will see. There's a button there called Video Cut, and this put the 64-column video into a 32-column mode. This was good for those blurry TVs. The page button on top of the unit toggled between the first 32 columns and the second 32 columns of a larger 64-column screen. The connector card edge is to connect the expansion unit for drives, printers and other things. It wasn't compatible with the TRS-80 connector, which has 40 pins. This one's got 50 pins, so if you wanted to plug in TRS-80 things, you had to use an adapter. Of course, right at the end there's a reset button. And that cord you see wrapped around at the bottom there comes from the built-in RF modulator, and it allows the machine to be plugged into a standard television. So you didn't need to buy a separate monitor for it. This is also a feature over and above that found in the TRS-80 Model 1. Here's the sticker on the bottom. You can see a copyright notice there that shows that the BASIC inside this machine was legal. It was the same Level 2 BASIC that Microsoft had licensed to Tandy. A business version of the System 80 was released about a year after the first model. You can see it here. This had a numeric keypad instead of the cassette recorder. It also had a few extra things in ROM, like a terminal program, designed to be used with discs, of course. The standard version also went through several revisions. As mentioned, the missing keys were added along with a level meter and volume control for the cassette recorder. Early models were uppercase only, but lowercase was quietly added in later black label revisions. The final version was the blue label variant, seen here. This had the arrow keys clearly labelled and in the same position as they were on the Model 1 keyboard. The blue label also contained a lowercase driver and a monitor program in ROM, and it included an amplifier for software sound routines. In theory, the amplifier was a good idea, but there was no volume control, so it could drive parents and partners nuts. Here's the System 80 naked. You can see the keyboard sitting across two boards there. The two boards are connected with very strong pieces of wire which are enclosed in plastic. They're soldered on one board and they poke into a plastic connector on the other. they're very, very stiff, and it's quite easy to break the soldering joints at the base of these series of wires when you're using them, so it's difficult to work with. Here we have the keyboard removed, and you can see the two boards there. The video board dealing with the display is the one on the right, and what's called the CPU board, with the CPU, the RAM and the ROM, is on the left. And notice the three ROM chips containing the 12K basic on the lower left of the CPU board, and those RAM chips to the right. The RAM chips in the System 80 are piggybacked, giving the system 48 kilobytes of RAM under the keyboard. This was a common modification, but the System 80 wasn't really designed to expand RAM this way. The more conventional way was to have 16K under the hood here and get the other 32K from RAM chips in the expansion unit, which I'll show you in just a moment. So let's get serious and play a game. Here's one that Dick Smith contracted specifically for this machine. This is a version of Space Invaders. So let's turn our machine on, and that's what we see when we turn a cassette-based System 80 on, a ready prompt. This differs from the TRS-80 Model 1 because they have a message that says memory size, whereas this just says ready. Pressing new line, which is the same as enter, the TRS-80 Model 1, and we're ready to load our game. So we'll put it into the cassette recorder. It's a machine language game, so we load it with the command system, and then next to the star we just put the first letter of the file and push new line. File on the tape being Invaders. So we'll push the play, around the tape goes, and we wait for the program to start. Now you see the level meter at the top there, the needle's just jumped up into the middle, so the cassette recorder is now feeding the program into the System 80. It takes a while, but we'll cut it down so you don't have to sit through the very long loading process. You can see it's the same as the TRS-80 Model 1. As this loads in, you get blinking asterisks up there in the upper right. That shows your game is coming through. If they show a C, it means there's some sort of checksum error. So our game's now loaded, and this is what it looks like. It doesn't have any sound, this one. It's silent, whereas many of the other TRS-80 games actually do produce sound. Not a bad variant of Space Invaders, this one. It's quite fast, and it's quite challenging. And I get wiped out pretty quickly, usually, in this particular game. But it's quite a fun one to play, so I think Dick Smith did quite a good job with this version. It doesn't use the arrow keys at all, so it's certainly a piece of software that can be played on those very early models of the System 80. Now I'll show you another piece of software that was written by, or contracted by Dick Smith for the machine. And this is one that would often play in the shop, so you'd see this one slowly going through a loop in the shop when the machine was on display. So we'll just run this program. It's now loaded. It's a graphic program, and you'll see that first thing it does is to fill the screen with pixels, so you get a large white square. And then, lo and behold, what do you see appearing in the square but the smiling face of Dick Smith himself? So there he is. Dick Smith's also a very parochial chap, so not only did you see his smiling face on the screensaver on machines that were set up in a shop, but you also saw the country of Australia as the second image. You can see it takes a while to draw graphics with these machines. This is running at almost 2 megahertz.
The graphics are actually quite fast in machine code, but when you're using BASIC, they can take a little while to show. So there you are, Dick Smith's screensaver. Now the Dick Smith offerings were pretty lame compared to the TRS-80 Model 1 games, and the System 80, at least the models that had the arrow keys, could certainly play all these games perfectly. So here we have one like Defense Command with its built-in voice. As I mentioned on the TRS-80 Model 1 video, I just find the sound routines quite remarkable considering there's no sound chip. It's all done in software and all done usually within 16K. So not only do you have the sound routines, of course, but you've got to have the game as well. So this is Defense Command. It's a game I used to play a lot in my System 80 days. So just indulge me a little bit here. I'm going to show you a few of these games. I know I covered them in the TRS-80 Model 1, but they were a big part of the System 80 as well. So they're certainly worth another look. So this is Meteor Mission. This was probably one of my favourite games, this one. Very challenging, well written. You can argue that the graphics were pretty crude and blocky, which is true, but it didn't detract from the game playing at all. They were still challenging games to play and a lot of fun. So we've got to try and wander through these missiles and beware of meteor showers as we go. Made it. This was another favourite game. This was Sea Dragon. And here you were in a submarine underwater and you had to find your way through various caverns. You had mines to contend with. You had things that shot missiles at you. You had boats that drop depth charges. Mines, not just fixed mines, but mines that floated up to you as well. So you had a lot of hazards, and it had a very sort of organic feel to it because it wasn't tremendously fast, but you only had a limited time to make decisions. And I'll show you this final arcade game. This is Scarfman, which of course is a clone of Pac-Man. Another game that I wheedled away many hours playing. So some of the fun that you could have on the Dick Smith System 80. Now if you wanted to run disk drives or a printer off your System 80, you had to plug this box in. This is the expansion unit. Not only did it allow you to plug in those peripherals, but as I mentioned, also allowed memory expansion from 16K to 48K, assuming it wasn't already under the keyboard. So the card edges from left to right are one for connecting the expansion card edge in the computer, one for the disk drives, and then one for the printer. The case was strong, so it was a good base for the screen, which could sit on top of it. So if we swing around and check out the side of the unit, you'll see the power supply unit there, similar to the one on the computer. And that black face plate in the corner could be popped out and a DB25 connector put in there if you had the optional RS232 fitted. So it was an unexciting box, but practical. So here you can see the System 80 kitted out for disk operations. So I've got a bit more gear here now. So we've got our expansion box plugged into the back, and I'll just swing around so you can see the expansion cables for that. There they are, the one from the computer, and that's the disk drive cable that you can see snaking away there. You can see there's quite a few cables snaking around the back here, adding to the spaghetti that you get behind these machines. Here are the two Dick Smith badged disk drives. These are both 40-track drives, single-sided, but you could actually have a mix of different drive types on your System 80, just as you could with the TRS-80 Model 1. So you can see a fully kitted out disk-capable System 80 does take up a bit of desk real estate, but you could use that area on the computer where the cassette recorder is for placing documents if you needed to refer to something while you were typing. So that came in handy. So let's boot up the machine. Dick Smith did sell a DOS with the machine called Oz80, which was actually Percom's micro-DOS, but I'm going to boot it up with NewDOS 80 version 2, which was a very popular TRS-80 Model 1 DOS. We used a lot here down under. Now, one thing about booting a disk-enabled unit is that you had a lot of switches to throw. So you had to switch on all your drives, the screen, the expansion box, all separately. They all had power cords before you actually switched on the computer itself. So we'll switch it on, and you see the classic garbage screen, which always occurs just before the software loads in. I'll give you a screen cam view of that process so you can see NewDOS 80 booting up. One of the reasons NewDOS 80 was so popular for these machines is that it catered for a wide variety of different disk drives. And the reason that was important was that drive technology changed very quickly in the early 1980s. So you could end up with a System 80 that had, say, one 40-track single-sided drive. It might have had one 40-track double-sided drive, and it could have had one 80-track double-sided drive, all on the same machine. So NewDOS was very good, and it could accommodate all of those different configurations. Once you had a couple of disk drives attached, the System 80 could be a very useful productivity tool. Here's a package called LazyWriter, which is a word processor, and with its 64-column screen, it was large enough to be useful as a word processor. In fact, I wrote my masterate thesis on a System 80, which was configured just as you see here. The only difference was that it had an acoustic coupler, so I could send my chapters through the telephone line to our university mainframe, formatting to put through the high quality printer. So it used to go over the phone line at 300 baud, which was about the speed of a moderate typist. And after the work was done, I'd relax with a game like Penetrator. That's a game name you probably wouldn't get away with these days, but it was one of my favourite games, very fast and very difficult. So on to some manuals, and there were 3 manuals that came with the machine. This one's the user manual, and this describes how to set up the machine. Like a lot of manuals of the day, it takes quite a light and whimsical approach to this to try and soothe people's anxiety about these newfangled gadgets. Then we had this one, which was programming for beginners, and this explained what programming was about, talked about some of the constructs that you'd find in a programming language. Very short introductory book. And then there was this one, this was the thickest of the lot, which was a basic reference manual. It wasn't a tutorial as such, but it was organized in chapters that dealt with various programming themes, and it simply explained what the commands did and gave an example or two. So more a reference book than a tutorial. I've also got this one that deals with using and setting up the expansion unit. One thing Dick Smith did very well was to support this machine with technical information. And in fact, he did more than that. He used to send a staff over to EACA regularly to help them with their quality control and advise on various things. And he came out with this technical manual for the machine, which is full of technical information. It also contains some modifications that people could do on the earlier models in order to make them a little more compatible with the TRS-80 Model 1. So there were 3 variations of this manual, and this is the second one. Now, it would be amiss of me not to mention this magazine, Micro-80. This magazine was sold in Australia and New Zealand. It actually and also the UK. It actually came out of the Adelaide Users Group, and it was a great vehicle for support for the System 80 in those days. So it had articles, it had letters to the editor, it had program listings, it had hardware modifications you could do, software, tricks and tips. So something all of our System 80 owners used to look forward to receiving every month. And here's just some shots of miscellaneous hardware I've got for the System 80. This is a Sysband 80 unit. This was sold by Micro-80 products that were connected with the magazine I just showed. And this enabled you to run TRS-80 peripherals from your System 80. Not disk drives, but essentially it gave you a TRS-80 expansion bus and a printer port. This is a more modern piece of hardware. This is a semi-virtual diskette, which I got for the machine a few years ago. And this enables me to transfer software from disk images that I can source from my PC and write them onto real floppy disks. So that's the Dick Smith System 80. Being my first computer, it is a machine I have a lot of nostalgic memories of and fondness for. And I do run and maintain a website on the System 80 where I've collected some historical information. I have some resources there. So if you're interested in finding out more, go and check that out. I'll put the URL in the credits at the end of this video.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that look at the Dick Smith System 80, or as it's known in Europe, the Video Genie, and in North America, the PMC-80. It's not a machine that set the world on fire when it came out, but in those years from 1981 to 82, certainly here down under, it was a classic computer. So until next time, keep well, and we'll see you in the next video.